to the latest edition of Paul Walsh Talks Advocacy and Influence. And today I am delighted to be joined by James Stephens, Managing Partner at Rood Peterson Public Affairs here in Brussels. James Stephens is a Brit with a tremendous amount of experience here. James, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Paul, it's a delight to be here. And just to correct you on your first statement, I'm actually a Brit, a Belgian, and an Italian now.
Okay, fine. I was one third right.
I'm the only, people were looking for Brexit benefits, and I found one, which is I can have some great nationalities. I love both Belgium and Italy as home countries now, but unfortunately, the Brexit benefit appears only to apply to this individual, which is a bit of a problem for the other 65 million Brits.
Yeah, but still, well done on the additional nationalities. Let's start with, let's say, the beginning of your career. I think you started out at the Parliament with Philip Whitehead. Was that a formative experience for you?
Exceptionally formative. As you go through life, I mean, not just work, but life generally, you're lucky to find people that are mentors, supporters, cheerleaders, inspirational figures. And I was so lucky. I took a flight. I was at the College of Europe in Natalin. I know probably a lot of your listeners have probably went through similar experiences, college, LSE, all sorts of usual institutions. And I was out there and I was offered an interview with Philip, who was representing the East Midlands region for the UK Labour Party in the European Parliament. And he flew me all the way from Poland to have the interview. And of course, I'm very excited about this. And then his assistant messages me to say that we're meeting in the Costa Cafe at Nottingham train station in an open place. And that was the mark of the man, always in a hurry, always doing things for his constituents. He was a great parliamentarian. I mean, he ended up being the chair of the Internal Market Committee. A lot of Brits ended up, Ollie McCarthy, Malcolm Harbour, others followed him. He ended up Internal Market Committee chair. He was on the Environment Committee and the Culture Committee at the beginning when I worked for him. He was one of those people, and I think you do get, Parliament is much maligned, right? But there are some great, great individuals that are hardworking. And he was one of those. I mean, he would do 13-hour days every day. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 13-hour days traipsing across the East Midlands. Sunday, at least have a day of rest for him, which was to go back down to London and work on his broadcasting company. He was an Emmy-winning broadcaster. He'd won 2 Emmys. So he was one of those guys, and I think that's what you need in this kind of town, who could master the detail of a file whilst never forgetting the big political principles that he stood for and who he represented. So to make that link, I think you got a lot of people can do the detail here, a lot of people that stay on the top level, and he could bridge those two things. And to this day, Paul, I miss him immensely. He died 18 years ago, I think 19 years ago this December.
Relatively young, right?
68, yeah. And he just bought a house in his home village in Derbyshire where he'd grown up, just off the Chatsworth estate, for those people who know that part of England, beautiful part of England if you've not been. So, yeah, he was relatively young, full of vigour, more vigour than me. We did an election campaign together in 2004. I took a sabbatical, and I remember at end of one of these 13-hour days, I'm absolutely knackered, I think is the technical term. And he said, "Come on then, shall we go to the cinema?" And I'm like, my God, man. Like, where do you get that energy? And I think the energy comes from doing something you're passionate about, right? And I think that's also something in this town sometimes we lack. Like, passion to wake up in the morning and do it again, right?
But the challenge for people like him and people who are in those positions today, MEPs, is to make what they're doing relevant to their constituents. So how was he able to do that?
As I said, Friday, Saturdays, he'd be visiting every constituency Labour Party there was that he could get in front of. He'd do fact site visits left, right and centre. Trying to get himself out there as much as possible and meet as many of those voters as possible. I think he was also blessed because of the areas he'd focused on in terms of legislation and policy. So I mentioned he's on the Environment Committee. Even though I did some environmental issues, that's how I got into kind of chemicals and environment policy at the beginning. Actually, his big thing was food safety. He was the rapporteur on EFSA, but also consumer policy generally. So the stuff that the EU does that's very personally relevant to citizens, actually. He was involved with a lot, Cosmetics Directive, 7th Amendment, all of those kind of files where you could make the link to people. And then on the culture side, he was on what was then called the TV Without Frontiers Directive, now the AVMS. And again, very visible to people. So I think, he also had this thing, that MEPs, if they want it, can have the power of a junior minister in government. And being an MEP, you have to, if you do it well, you're basically trading power for prestige, right? So maybe MEPs are not valued as prestigious a post, but if you do it right and work hard and you're like Philip, you can master the detail while not forgetting your political principles, you can have an amazing influence on people's lives, right? How about being part of a group of people that set up the agency that looks after our food safety? I mean, that seems like a great legacy, to be honest, right?
Saving people's lives, improving people's health. Absolutely.
And I want to give a call out because honestly, we all start somewhere. I started in the European Parliament. I hate to break it to council and commission people, but it's still my favourite institution. And I think there's some wonderful people in there doing really good work for which they don't get enough praise, if I'm perfectly honest.
They certainly don't. Why is it your favourite institution?
Well, I like the fact that it is a bit party political. I like the fact that it's pretty open. I think, Politico, when they rolled into town, wanted to speak about politics and people rather than process and policy. Probably came to the wrong town for that. But if there's anywhere where there is people, personality, and it can be expressed, it's got to be in the European Parliament, right? You see some...
And do you think this sometimes mischaracterization sometimes that it's just a token sort of politics? It's just there to give the impression of politics where the real power still sits with the Commission. Do you think that's a caricature?
I think somewhat. I mean, I think we shouldn't overlook the fact that our union is still one of 27 sovereign countries who are pooling that sovereignty to get stuff done. But I think, in the areas in which the Parliament has what used to be called, to some of us who are old, co-decision power, the Parliament can have weight. And I think credit to the Parliament over the years for using the maximum of its powers to increase its leverage and its power within the system, or competences rather. So I think you're right. We have a system. I just was on the phone to people out of Canada, right? Clients out of Canada who we just started working with. And when you start mentioning that the Commission has the sole right of initiative on legislation, they look at you a bit funny, right? Like not a normal thing in pretty much every other system. So, but I do think the power to amend and adopt, and the power of, the parliamentarians have a little bit of a bully pulpit, right? They can raise issues, they can put stuff they can act as a kind of pressure group within the system to get things on the agenda. There is power in that. And I think all credit to them, the ones that do it well.
So I guess as somebody who went to the College of Europe, you had a pro-European, pro-EU outlook from the beginning. Did your experience at the Parliament enhance that? And are you able to kind of continue that today? Or is that part of what you're trying to do? I think influencing the EU is still important for you?
I think like a lot of people, I fell into this life and this role, right? I mean, I used to go and stay in a tent in France as a kid with my parents. I kind of liked being outside of England. And then I got interested in Labour politics locally and was active in Labour politics at a kind of youth level within my hometown, and kind of naturally took a series of steps which, if you look at my CV, look like they were real choices of career and actually were just accidental things that logically led to something else. I had a great time in the Parliament. The reason I didn't want to stay in the Parliament, and Philip did offer me to go back at one point and work for him again, was I kind of missed what my first boss in consultancy says was the so what. So great that the EPP said this, great that the S&D, whatever it was called, the PES, I think at the time, did this and said this, great that vote. But why does that matter to the real world? What's the real impact on people? And the thing I love about my job, right, is you've still got that foot in the political and the policy, but you're able to have a discussion and be the interlocutor with people, real Europeans running real European businesses, mostly in our case, who can give you the insight, well, if they do that, this is what's going to happen here, right? And I think that bit of the so what, why is it important that vote went that way, was the bit that got into me, along with the entrepreneurialism of consultancy. I'm an entrepreneur. I love, building businesses, and that part of it is also really important to me.
So the so what part, could you kind of deduce from that being a lobbyist in Brussels is playing an important part in the democratic process?
Hey, look, when I moved to this firm now 7 years ago already, what was really important to me was that it was a European company, one that I also was an owner of and could help build. Values were important to me, which we defined as a team, but also purpose. And at one point, a year or two in, we've done a lot of work on values and behaviours internally, And I realized I was missing the why question. Like, what's the thing above the purpose bit of it? And I read a book that said the leader needs to define the purpose. Actually, it's not something that a committee can put together. So I'll have to say I'd had a few glasses of wine on the Eurostar, and there I was with my laptop open, and I banged out my purpose memo, which everyone in the building gets when they join. And my purpose is to help build European-level democracy. That's why I'm here. I might do public affairs for a living, but my purpose is to help build European-level democracy. And I think I've done that for the last 24 years. I think there have been clients that have walked through my door, not only clients who are businesses, but clients who are people who are Europeans that through my support and our support, both in my last place and this place, have learned how this place functions and realized it's not so scary. And yes, it is a bit complex, but most governmental processes are complex, right? But yes, if you've got the right combination of things, you can influence it. It will listen to you and it will react to what you say. You might not always go where you want, but they will take on board your views, right?
Now, just to play devil's advocate on that, because I think some people would say that as a lobbyist, you're representing generally the people who can afford to try and influence policy. And as a result of successful lobbyists, it can create a sort of imbalance where a certain small subset of vested interests have disproportionate influence. And this is, in fact, not democratic.
I mean, I take the point that there is a minimum threshold of resources required to interface with, to conduct public affairs. I take that point. There is clearly a barrier to entry of being of a certain size of kind of organizations. But my experience has been that once you've passed that threshold, which isn't that high, if I'm honest, for organizations, then actually there are a bunch of other factors which influence whether you will be able to shape the policy coming out of the legislative process. And so I would kind of push back and say, again, going back to Philip, right? I would sit there as 10 lobbyists came through the door every day, right? And I would listen to them. And at the end of the day, the man was one of the smartest people I knew, was the president of the Oxford Union. He listened to what everyone said. And then he made up his own damn mind based on what he thought was his political principles and the people who represented him. Yeah. And if all we traded is insight and argument, and then an elected person like Philip then makes up his mind at the end of the day, that feels a lot like democracy.
Sure. So if they're doing their job, there's nothing to really be ashamed of from the lobbying point of view.
Honestly, I'm proud to be a lobbyist. I would happily, stand up and say this is a great profession and it enables me to live my purpose. What's that Japanese thing with the Venn diagram? Where
yes, I forget what it's called.
Ikigama or something like that, right?
Yeah.
But, it's like it allows you to do that. And I think when people criticize lobbyists, mainly they focus on corporate lobbyists, forgetting that the NGO community and all sorts of other people are also lobbyists too, and are also trying to influence the system for different reasons, good reasons, and rightly so, right? I think they forget that the people that work inside corporations, the people that work in consultancies in this town, all are Europeans by and large, and all probably arrived here because they believed in the European project.
Yeah.
And actually, the thing that frustrates me sometimes is I think I believe in the European project and I'm more passionate about it than some of the people that work in the institutions sometimes, who are there doing their day job and taking a nice salary. And I get frustrated when I think, where's our single market? Like, why haven't we completed that, right? Like, I get frustrated when I see some of the decisions as a European citizen and taxpayer.
And it's not the case as well that the industry lobbyists or industry has an upper hand in Brussels.
Just take the example of the oil and gas industry, who I've worked with in the past quite extensively, right? Would you say they're winning on climate policy?
There you go.
You want to count how many millions of euros that industry has spent on advocacy? Are they really winning? If you're an environment NGO looking at climate policy over the last 20 years, do you think the oil and gas guys have won the argument? So I think, that's to pick up on them, but we could talk about other sectors, financial services, tech sectors, all of these people, right? And that's why I think there's a bit of a misnomer, to be honest, in the transparency registry where they talk about fees that people pay, because it makes the link in people's mind that the amount of money that you spend somehow has an influence on it, when in fact, all you're talking about is people's salaries, right?
Yep.
Like that's what that money goes on. It's like people's salaries. So if I'm a cigarette manufacturer who we don't work for here, and I employ 10 people, am I any more likely to get my way at DG Sante than if I employed one person? Like, honestly. So I think there's a whole bunch of other things that we can come on to that probably do influence how successful you are.
So looking at things then from the client side, do you think that Brussels has become more political, and therefore it's much more important for companies to be visible and present and involved in the political process here?
It depends what you mean by political. So I think it's more political in the fact that I think the perception of public opinion, I'm going to say the perception, because last time I checked, other than like the Eurobarometer thing, which I'll smile about, not a lot of people poll citizens on what they actually think about policy issues on a daily basis. So I think the perception of public opinion and how that then translates into the actions and the drive coming out of the Commission in particular. And I would say, I think we'd all remark, certainly in the last maybe 10 years, the Commission has become more political. And what I mean by that is more attuned to how its decision-making and the policy it puts out reflects what it believes to be public opinion.
But I mean, we had a recent discussion with Daniel Gagan. He's talking about, in fact, it's on the one hand becoming more political, kind of decisions being made kind of in advance of the technocratic lawmaking process. But in fact, at the same time, becoming a lot more bureaucratic through impact assessments, through comitology, delegated acts and so on, making it more difficult for industry to really have an influence because generally they're not upstream enough in the process.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. And I think the comment that you made at the end about being upstream in the process is kind of a golden rule of advocacy for anyone, right?
But aren't the industry worse at this than NGOs, or at least in the previous mandate?
I think NGOs do have an upper hand in some regards, right? I mean, generally speaking, their people have more passion. You know, that's why they work for an NGO. Like they get up in the morning like the Duracell bunny and do it all again and never ever stop, which is great for the environment and all sorts of other causes that they espouse. I think it's easy for all organizations to react to something that they see in front of them. So if I'm sat down with a client, and any person, and I say, here's a paragraph, can you critique my paragraph for you? Whatever that paragraph is about, let's pretend it's a piece of legislation. But then I say, here's a blank piece of paper. Can you write me a paragraph of what you'd like us to do? A much harder exercise, right? So I think that already gives a bias to later on in the process. I think the other thing is you've got to remember within all organizations, certainly corporate organizations, and I'm generalizing, right? And I'll come on to how I think it's evolved if you let me. But things that are 2-3 years down the line, if you're working for a publicly traded company, you've got to be pretty enlightened to get the attention of the people who you need. And I think the best lobbyists are those ones that are the most integrated with the people that they serve internally, like the corporate lobbyists, right? They get the insight from the business, they've got the business's backing. But, you know, if you wander in and say, well, you know, we've got a communication out, which means potentially in 5 years, there's legislation that might do this. And then 3 years after that, after a legislative process, and then 2 years after that, the directive. So we're talking about like 9 years away, right? And I can imagine as a business leader, me looking at that and saying, well, hang on a minute. My issue is energy costs today. Great that you're telling me in 9 years I might have a problem. But what about today? Can you focus on today, please? Because we got the quarterly results coming, right?
But the stuff that's happening today is stuff that was decided 9 years ago.
Yeah. And what I'm saying is an inbuilt, I think there's an inbuilt short-termism. I mean, it's not a criticism, it's just an observation, right, within industry to look at today. Now, I think that has developed over time, right? So I think, you know, if I go back even at the beginning of my career, how did clients come to us? It was things like, we've seen this amendment in the Environment Committee and it spells the end of our company, right? Like, please do something about that. Like, that still happens, right? There are still people who are not paying attention, you know, not following. And maybe there your barrier to entry is an issue, right? Because clearly the smaller guys are probably less likely to be following what's going on in Brussels on a day-to-day basis. Yep. But I think you have also seen a shift. I think industry has become more enlightened, which is, you know, and it'd be interesting to see how that changes, particularly in light of what's going on the other side of the Atlantic, right? People saying, what I need to do is work out where my company wants to go and align that with where I think external stakeholders, including government, want to go. And if I can set out a long-term view of where I want to go, then I can shape pre-legislative, right?
Yep.
And so sometimes when I read academic stuff, I know you've had a few academics on your podcast, sometimes I remember having a discussion with one of them a few years ago, and they saw when they were addressing interest representation and its influence, one of the criteria, the variables they used was alignment with public opinion. And they were doing some kind of textual analysis from when the proposal came out to when it was adopted, and then contrasting it with positions of stakeholders. I'm saying, well, hang on a minute, guys. You're starting at this point when actually the real influence probably happened in the 3 years before that. We're a consensus building machine in Brussels generally, right? We're not a conflictual system. But equally, you're assuming that public opinion is constant and it can't be changed by actors. So if I run a thought leadership PR program for the next 3 years for an industry to influence something 5 years down the line, the likelihood is that perceived public opinion, if I'm successful in my program, will be more aligned with my view. Yep. I just started my advocacy earlier.
Yep.
Right. And I think that, and I know academics have to look in, all of us have to look in a certain time frame and create systems that we can understand. But I think the smarter organizations have moved upstream, right? They have moved upstream, and they've tried to look at it not just from a purely a government, but what is society expecting. And I think what you need for that is pretty much enlightened business leadership, actually. I think you can't enact that change within your organizations, the public affairs GR function. That has to come from C-suite, right? That's their view of how the world's going to go, that we're going to do it. Now, the interesting thing with what's going on in our world at the moment is in the reaction to what's going on in DC is, are those kind of leaders of corporate organizations, are they shifting their view or just being replaced? Like, do we see that in the next 5 years, or do we go back to much more transactional, stop this, stop that? Because there's a lot of stop this, stop that coming out of the US in terms of policy at the moment, in terms of Europe, right? And I think that our narrative here, and you saw that with Green Deal, right? Green Deal, suddenly all the corporates wake up and they say, you know what? If we want to be part of this game, we have to, have the same language. We have to have a view of 2050 where we're going on climate. We have to do all of those things.
So industry was adapting to the lawmaking processes to become more long-term, but given the way that things are developing today, maybe that's less relevant.
Maybe. I actually think the challenge, I was, reading some of the statements from people around the clean industrial deal, right? It was notable that the NGOs' actual reactions was pretty much sticking to their narrative of this commission. And I do,
as if nothing has ever happened, has happened.
Nothing has changed. Like, the world didn't change. We still need to focus on exactly what we were doing before. You guys are going off path. And it's like, guys, if you were my corporate client, I'd be advising you, well, let's rethink our narrative and make ourselves relevant again. Because very quickly, you can say that a couple of times, but if you keep saying that, you will become irrelevant to where this ship is sailing.
Yeah.
So I think the NGOs currently face the challenge that industry faced 5 years ago.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and industry, I think, did adapt, actually. It doesn't mean...
Didn't industry overcorrect and become too quiet and not stress competitiveness? There was always, look at us, we're so environmentally friendly,
yeah,
and so on.
And I think there is a bit of that. I mean, I've heard stories of corporates where, sat in industry associations where, they'll say, it's not the end of us, but the costs of implementing what is being proposed is astronomical for no environmental benefit that we can ascertain, right? But just to show that the Commission's doing environmentally positive stuff. And then being asked, well, if we want to stop this, this is what we have to do, right? We have to be public about this. We have to beat the Commission up and point out the hypocrisy of what they're proposing. And those same companies say, oh, no, we can't do that. It might harm our reputation.
Absolutely.
And you're like,
that
guys,
was the mistake.
You have a reputation to enable you to do things, right? Yeah. So you can have a great reputation as a company, but if you've got no business, it doesn't really matter that everyone thinks you're a great company, right? So I think there was a little bit, we couldn't possibly say to the institutions that this is madness and doesn't get to their goal. We don't want to offend everyone or upset anyone. So I think you're right. I think there's a difference, though, between having a long-term view and shaping and still speaking truth to power and saying, guys, we're the guys you're regulating. This is what this is going to mean practically. Like, it's going to add these costs, and that means we can't do this that you want us to do over here, right? That'll mean that we do close these factories. And I think there is a little bit, we're a little bit too consensual sometimes when we're advocating, when we don't need to be aggressive or conflictual, but we do need to kind of be honest about, well, this is how we see the world, guys.
Let's say we take the past 6 months culminating in the omnibus packages. Can we say that this is a success story for industry lobbying?
I don't know. I think it depends on who you speak to in industry, right? Some people have invested and probably don't like the things that have been agreed and postponed. So I think, again, when I was referring to the NGO movement earlier, I think you have to be careful to generalize. I mean, I'm not sure postponing legislation or altering legislation that's yet to be implemented is a real success story, right? I think if we start seeing, I don't know, if we start seeing some of REACH being simplified and made more friendly towards the chemical sector at the end of the year, or we see other pieces of legislation, and we don't see simplification just look like taking 7 pieces of legislation and rolling them to one big piece of legislation, but actually taking stuff out of the official journal and saying it doesn't apply anymore, that's existing and being implemented. I think then I'll start believing that things have really changed.
You wanted to go back to just how lobbying has changed. So tell us a bit about that.
As I say, I think politicization, digitalization, meaning use of digital tools to communicate, clearly also entry of new member states and exit of one member state, all of that has changed the nature of what we're doing. I think it's become more sophisticated, and people may take sophisticated as a bad word, right? Like sophisticated means you finding devious ways to do things. I don't mean that. I mean, like lobbying is a communications discipline, right? There is an audience, we have a message, we use a channel, right? And we seek to enact change in behavior or opinions. It's just communications. Yep. Like, I don't buy the whole public affairs is not communications thing. I say, yeah, we have all the things that communications is about, right? I think what's changed is as this place has become more competitive for share of voice, as politicians rightly have sought to address bigger issues and take into account public opinion, I think the channels in which we seek to advocate has evolved. More channels have become available. By the way, I started the first agency blog in town in like 2007. And then I started the first agency Twitter feed. It's now called something else, right?
At the time, people were asking you, what are you doing?
What are you doing? And I was just saying, honestly, I love agency life because you can kind of experiment, right? The job of people like myself who run agencies is to always say, yes, that sounds like a good idea. What do you need? Oh, nothing. Okay, go off and try that then, right? Yeah. If you can monetize that, go and do it. So I'm just saying, like, the channels that we use now are much broader than they were 10 years ago, certainly 23 years ago when I started, right? I think the level of sophistication about how we consult and talk to our clients has changed. I think if I go back in the day of, probably when Paul Adamson, first started out, bless him, one of the founders, the founder perhaps of public affairs in Brussels, along with a few others, Catherine, Caroline, people like that, Julia, they probably, get amendments on a fax machine from the Parliament, right? And they'd, write a position paper and then go meet people, right? And that was what we did. I think now there's certainly in my firm, and I think in a lot of our peers who are very good firms as well, right? I'm not saying we're special or different. Consulting is it's consultancy. We consult, right? We ask questions of our clients. We challenge their thinking. We have models. We're consulting. I think that's changed. And that then reflects the tactics that we use, the channels that we use. I think there's a lot more work is done around the messaging side of things. And, I think there's a real realization that industry fights on facts, loses on emotion. And so the whole left brain, right brain thing, all of that has evolved, right?
But don't you think that with all of these new avenues, new communications opportunities, this increased focus on communication, that lobbyists find themselves spread too thin and so don't have the time to really reflect with any great depth on, let's say, the implications of a new amendment?
I'm not sure about that. I think my observation would be the good lobbyist or advocate is looking at the challenge that they face and is kind of working out, yes, understanding implications. And I think, I say, if you work in-house, if we're really honest, your primary audience is the people that pay your bill at headquarters, right? You spend most of your time talking to them, not talking to policymakers, if we're honest, right? I think a lot of that is still done, and we certainly try to do that with our clients. I think the bit where I think the sophistication comes in is then looking at an issue that you're trying to advocate on, and doing all the normal stuff you do, the stakeholder mapping and, working out what people's positions are, but then also thinking on that tactical choice, kind of what kind of issue is in it and what kind of bits of my toolkit should I be using given where I'm trying to get to. So, if it's a marginal issue in a legislative file that no one's debating, probably meeting 4 MEPs and the commission official is probably still okay, right? Like you can probably do that and as long as you've got a good case and you put it well, like people will listen and go, yeah, okay, the commission forgot about you in its proposal. Didn't know you under scope, and suddenly you find this problem. Let's give you an exemption, and that can be for many industries. A lot of their work is on that. If you're central to the case, I know you're the car industry on CO2 emissions for passenger cars. The likelihood is you needed to do all your work in the 5 years prior to that proposal. You probably needed to do public stuff as well as technical stuff. You probably needed to build lots of allies, and you needed to make sure that your coalition of interest was far greater than the opposing coalition of interest, none of which it seemed to me that they did. But if you're more central and it's bigger politically, your tactical selection can be wider. And I think the challenge I have for us all is it's great to have all of these different tools, but I think the smart person sits down and says, given this issue, given this thing, which of these tools do I use? Because you don't always need the big pneumatic drill, right, of public opinion. And I think that's the key skill of people in our world now, along with crafting great arguments, building relationships, is having that strategic thinking to know, faced with this thing, how do I modulate my response to it?
Yeah, because there would be a temptation to develop a template or a formula that you just apply to every case, and you just sell, but sometimes that's relevant and sometimes it's completely unnecessary.
Yeah, and I think if I was to criticize my own part of the world, right, I think the bad consultant comes in and tells the clients they always need new windows on the house, right? Oh, you've got a house. I've got new windows. You need windows put in, right? And sometimes they don't need new windows. They need, a new front door, or they need to go on holiday or something else.
I want to hear you make the case that sometimes these windows can work, because there are lobbyists who tell me, listen, I'm completely invisible on social media. I just need to have a good understanding of the topic, have a couple of meetings. I have the relationships already. I can make a difference that way. I
think you can in certain occasions, and maybe then their clients self-select that person for that job, right? Like if you only sell pens, then you only get people. If you advertise yourself as the guy that sells pens, only people who want to buy pens are going to come to you, right? So maybe it works for that individual. I think if I was on the client side, though, I'd be looking for a good consultant to help me work through my problem, work out how on this occasion for me as an organization do we tackle this problem in a way that works. And actually the way you tackle it might be different depending on the client side in front of you with exactly the same issue, right? So I'm a big believer that advocacy should be, the way you do advocacy should also reflect authentically how the client organization is, right? And you see that. You see companies who, are full of engineers, and their approach to advocacy is we'll send loads of experts with facts, and we'll be the kind of knowledge holder within the system. And you see other ones who are like, take our friends at Oatly with their, advertising hoardings about oat milk, right? Don't work for them. But, a very different approach to lobbying, which actually reflects how they are as a company, it strikes me. Both perfectly good.
Can decent social media output support a good lobbying campaign?
Yeah, I think the question is not can it. I think it can. I think is when should it? Like, when's the most effective time to deploy? So I'm not convinced, or I remain to be convinced, that pumping out social media content around a vote to say vote for Amendment 53 is a good way to do it when you could just ring those people who are about to vote or knock on their door, right? I think when you're in that policy formulation stage and you want to put some messages out about where you want policy to go generally and how it aligns with what you're doing and what the policymakers are doing, and you're raising awareness and understanding, there you go. I say, like, we go through 4 steps, right? Awareness, understanding, belief, action. Like, it's the equivalent of the marketing funnel for public affairs, right? And I think maybe your social media content might be actually okay on 1 and 2. I'm not sure it influences 3 and 4. Maybe there are other tactical selections you might make to push the guy, to motivate him to take the action, I think. Now, I don't know, maybe on a vote, I gobsmacked with the car industry, the parts suppliers, what they're talking about, maybe 300,000 people losing their jobs in Germany, right? As we move away from the ICE. Like, the farmers came to town and their tractors, stuff changed. Where's the 300,000 German auto parts workers? Because I tell you what, if they'd have turned up, People at the Birmingham one would have listened, right? Like maybe those guys knocking on your door at the end of the vote might have worked, right?
Did policy making, did lawmaking get a bit divorced from reality in the last mandate? I mean, forget about the lobbying part, but just the fact that these things weren't thought through properly. That's my first question. What I'm interested in is, well, did that have anything to do with Brexit? Were the British officials, British politicians helping ensure that there was a more realistic view on the implications of policy when Britain was part of the EU?
Listen, I feel a little bit hypocritical because for years I would say to people, I wish that the Commissioner grow cojones, and instead of cojones, I think that's the Spanish word for balls. Yeah, yes, right. Because the Commission was always very good, and some of the academics you've had on have done papers on it, I think, about finding that consensus before they put out the proposal, and that's it's probably a good idea in our kind of consensus building system. But you always want the Commission to stretch it slightly, right? To stretch it, to have an agenda, as von der Leyen did in the last mandate, and to stretch the Council of Parliament, and to accept that it wouldn't get everything, and maybe the Council would always row back and want more flexibility from member states and slightly lower targets, right, for whatever legislation. But I said at the beginning, so this is my hypocritical bit, I used to say that a lot. And then when Green Deal happened, I was like, as a European, I'm really worried, because we might deliver Green Deal and destroy the European Union, right? We might get a Green Deal. We might get all this legislation through, but the impact that a fundamental economic and societal transformation is going to have on Europeans is huge. And yet the deal part of European Green Deal was, I know we had a just transition fund and all that kind of stuff. For me, you looked around and you said, there are loads of people in member states that don't realize that this deal is also about some losers as well as winners. And we at a European level have really not got the firepower to redistribute wealth, right? That's a member state thing. The member states can do that and some of them can't, right? But the member states can do that. And so we're all having this nice discussion here about how we're going to reach these climate goals, how we got all this ambitious legislation, how we're going to do all these things. Industry is meekly saying, yes, we're going to do it. We're all going to go along with you. And yet there's large swathes in the industrial heartlands of Germany who, during any transition, are going to be really negatively affected. I'm just talking about Germany, who can probably cope with it if they change the budget thing, probably can cope with it, but there are a load of other member states that can't. And you know that what's going to happen, talk about my favourite former member state, you know what's going to happen is the member states will create credit for the good stuff, and all the bad stuff they will blame on Brussels, even though they were in the room, even though a lot of it was their idea. And I fear that a lot, right? And now we've had this rebalance and we've gone the other way. And let's see if, when we actually see action, whether it's actual real action or it's just rhetoric, let's see, right? Because we're still other frameworky kind of stuff, right? Well, let's see when proposals start to really come out of this commission that in that clean industrial deal, what it really means.
But you are agreeing with me that the commission did become a bit divorced from reality.
The
lack of the British element in that, was that a factor?
I'm going to defend the Commission a little bit, right? I'm going to say the Brussels bubble is by its essence divorced from reality, right? Like, look at us all. We're all like white, middle class and highly educated. This is not how most voters are, last I checked. And we all speak to each other and think that's public opinion, right? Yeah. And it only took me one election campaign in 2004 knocking on the border doors of Nottingham East to realise that isn't the real world, right? Like, we don't. So what? Like, so what for my guy who lives in Nottingham East? His neighbour's got his house boarded up, right? So, and that's 2004. To your British question, yeah, I mean, if I speak to people, and I do employ a decent amount of senior advisors who've come out of the EU institutions, also have different nationalities now, but are British in nature. And I've asked people, even when Brexit happened, people were sad, right? And they were sad for a reason. Like, Britain used to have a reputation, perhaps no longer, perhaps recovering, for having really, really good MEPs, like Philip, Malcolm, all of these people, Graham, Chris, all of these people, really hardworking. I mean, I'm just naming the ones that come to mind. There was many more. An amazingly good UCREP, an amazingly good civil service, a great administrative capacity, and a propensity to look at a problem and say, well, like, pragmatically, what's the best solution here, right? Yep. Yeah, and I think I've got to believe that the EU misses that to this day, and maybe some of the sharp edges on it. Although on climate stuff, right, the UK was always one of the leaders, right? So, but still, there's at least a pragmatism and an openness to engage with industry from UK government normally, right?
overall in this discussion, we're going to draw to a close in a few minutes, but overall in this discussion, we've been quite optimistic about the role of lobbyists and lobbying in Brussels as well. I think it presents quite a positive picture. What do you think needs to improve?
What do you think needs to improve? I think, one of my dreams actually is to professionalise our sector even further. Like, you know what? I think this is important enough that we should, have some kind of like chartered institute for public affairs practitioners, that we should have to go and have professional qualifications. Like in some way, I know it's a bit like out of scope or a bit crazy, but I'd like us to be that. I'd like to prevent the idea that a former MEP can come out of the Parliament and set up his own public affairs consultancy. I'd like to stop that, actually. Like, that's the bit I don't like, because we don't trade on access. When people try to buy access from us as a company, I say we don't do that.
But the thing is, you don't need that. You don't need to have an MEP on your team to be influenced.
But I think,
but that's the thing that people don't realize. That's just to sell stuff to clients. That's not to be more influential.
The more professional we are, the better. I'd like to professionalise us even further as a profession. I don't use the same word twice, don't I? But I'd like to see that. I think there's still, even with my talk about how it's changed and what we do differently now, there's still a way to go on some of that stuff, right? There's still pockets of resistance, as you mentioned, the person imaginary or real that says I just need to know 3 people. I think that does us a disservice as a profession. And I think there's still a way to go. If I think outside of the consulting side of it and think about the client side, I think there's still a way to go in a lot of organisations. And you think this is bizarre, right? I mean, think about the last 5 years, basically everyone worked for government. Like, all of these corporations were dependent on government, right, for money, for support, and going to be so in the future. Like, government's playing an increasing role in our economy, not a less and less role. So, I think within, I'm going to say corporates, because they're the ones I know well, I think there's still a job to be done within the function of, whether you call it public affairs or government relations or public policy, whatever it's entitled, like its status within the organisation. And does it get a seat when those strategic discussions are being had, or does it come in after decisions have been taken to sort out the mess, right? Because they didn't consider the external environment. Now, again, I'm generalising, right? There are very many really good people in this town, good organisations who have that seat, who advise C-suite level on all that's going on here and help generate where their company should go because of that advice. But I think there's probably still a lot out there that are so far removed from business decision making that, if I was on,
because it's almost dependent on the professional that's in the company rather than how they see the position. So it's different to say a legal counsel within a company where you would have a very clearly defined role.
No large company that's making, let's just say over €1 billion, maybe even over €100 million, is ever going to consider operating without a chief legal counsel and a CFO. Like, they're just not, right? And we're talking relatively small barriers to entry there. Like, there are so many organisations that still don't have a, head of external relations, head of GR, whatever it is, right? Whatever that function's called, right? So many of them. And you think at a time where government decisions affect your business day to day, whether you live, thrive, survive, you don't have that function at the table. So I think you're right. I think there are some amazing professionals in this town. There's some of the smartest people you can ever meet, right? And they clearly find a way to get to
exactly.
But it's not, I think your point is really well made, Paul. It's not a structural thing. It's a individual personality thing. Still, come on.
So there's work to do, and it's on us. It's on the profession.
A lot.
Very good, James Stephens. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thank you.